Across the Russia-Ukrainian war, here's the most important figure that most people have never heard of. According to some, he's a businessman, cunning, calculated, and able to maximize his own profit in an exceptionally difficult situation. According to others, he's a reformed crime lord, or perhaps not so reformed after all. According to others, he is a savior to the Ukrainian cause, a man without whom the nation likely would have collapsed under the strain of war. And according to some, he is a shadow leader, puppeteering the Ukrainian state against the will of its president and behind the backs of its people. His name is Rinat Akhmetov, and if one thing about him is clear, it's that Akhmetov is among the most complicated yet critically important characters in the story of the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, he's the country's richest man, an oligarch of stunning means. But on the other hand, he's also much more than that, a man who rose up from nothing in a community that is, today, firmly under Russian control, but who has done more for Ukrainian defense than perhaps any single Ukrainian who's not named Zelensky. On today's special episode of WarGraphics, we're going to take a close look at Rinat Akhmetov, his origins, his empire, his interests, and his place in the Ukraine of today.
Have you ever Googled yourself and found more information than you expected to be out there? Pretty scary stuff, right? And in today's world, our personal data is just floating around the internet, waiting to be scooped up by data brokers and sold to anyone willing to pay. But don't worry, there's a way to fight back and protect your privacy, and that is through today's sponsor, Incogni. Imagine getting a call about a loan you never applied for. The data broker might have sold your personal information to cyber criminals, but things could well be different if you use Incogni. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requesting your personal data be removed and dealing with any objections. And it doesn't stop there. Incogni keeps your data off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. Signing up is a breeze. First, create an account and tell Incogni whose data to remove, then grant them the right to work for you. Finally, sit back and relax as Incogni handles everything, keeping you updated every step of the way. It's a simple 3-step process that puts you back in control of your personal information. Want to try it out? Well, Incogni offers a risk-free 30-day trial. Plus, if you use the code WarGraphics at the link below, you'll get a whopping 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/WarGraphics. So take your personal data back with Incogni. A big thank you to Incogni for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back to it.
Rinat Akhmetov was born in September of 1966 in the city of Donetsk. Although today Donetsk is internationally recognized as a part of Ukraine, at least by the majority of the world's nations, it was recognized back then as part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic under the broader umbrella of the Soviet Union. To give you an idea of just how Soviet Donetsk was at that time, it had been renamed just 5 years prior to Akhmetov's birth from the prior name of Stalino, simplified a few decades earlier simply as Stalin. Akhmetov's father, Denet, was a coal miner, as were a large proportion of working-age men in Donetsk and across the Far East and Donbass region of modern-day Ukraine. Akhmetov's mother, Nyakia, worked in a modest shop. Ethnically Tatar and a practicing Sunni Muslim, Akhmetov is believed to have had a relatively quiet childhood alongside his brother Igor, who would grow up to be a coal miner for most of his life. But from his humble beginnings, Akhmetov has grown to a level of personal and professional success unmatched in the history of his nation. Year over year, Akhmetov has consistently ranked at the top of the list of Ukraine's richest individuals, and although his wealth has fluctuated significantly over the decades for reasons that we'll explore closely, his lead on the next richest Ukrainian oligarch is so great that at times he's commanded 3 times the wealth of a given year's runner-up. He owns a gigantic holdings company based in Cyprus, an international steel and mining group, a major Ukrainian bank, and the football club FC Shakhtar Donetsk, amongst a wide range of other assets. He's a noted philanthropist, among the most prolific in Ukraine in recent decades, and he's been a powerful player in national politics, as we'll see, since he came into possession at the start of his fortune. At times, his companies and their subsidiaries have employed close to 500,000 people and have accounted for substantial portions of Ukraine's GDP. It's a hell of a turn for a young nobody from the Donbass to rise far enough that he now stands firmly entrenched alongside the world's 1,000 wealthiest people, even on his worst day. And by all accounts, that turn has come with some serious perks. Akhmetov owns London's most expensive penthouse. He flies around in an Airbus A319, and he vacations at his €200 million French villa, once owned by King Leopold II of Belgium. And while he has never held Ukraine's highest office as president, he's come into possession of obscene amounts of perhaps the most powerful resource of all, influence. Akhmetov is an inescapable figure inside Ukraine, love him or hate him, and he's the sort of multi-billionaire who hasn't grown rich by expanding out beyond his own country. Instead, he's diversified and spent his wealth in Ukraine in ways that make him and his business ubiquitous. In Ukraine, Akhmetov's utility companies keep the lights on, his telecoms industry keeps the phones working, his agricultural holdings keep bread on the table, his real estate holdings provide homes and storefronts, his bank holds the money, and even his footballers keep the people entertained. And now the war has ravaged his home nation, he's turned that money back toward his country to a stunning degree. He's had complex relationships with Ukraine's political leadership over time, and has even been at odds with Ukrainian leaders past and present. But when it comes to power, he stands as tall as any of them, and perhaps even a little taller. In order to understand who Akhmetov is today, though, we've got to go back in time to the early years of an independent Ukraine in the 1990s. Now, it's about this point in our episode that we do have to include a disclaimer. Mr. Akhmetov is, among other things, a fairly litigious individual, although less so today than he used to be. So we'd like to make it very, very clear that we're simply discussing accounts of Akhmetov's life and his work that investigative journalists have deemed worthy of publication, and that, to our knowledge, have not been substantially refuted. We at War Graphics don't endorse any interpretation of the competing claims we're going to highlight, and we trust that our viewers will be able to come to their own conclusions, but also like to preface everything we're about to say with a quote from Akhmetov himself provided to the Washington Post in 2022. Quoting here, "I have never been involved with any criminal organizations, I have never been prosecuted, and no criminal charges were pressed against me." But while we're not the ones saying it, a range of sources have alleged, over time, that the beginnings of Akhmetov's personal fortune may not have been entirely legitimate. The Ukrainian SSR in those days was a difficult and often dangerous place to be, especially in the Donbass region and in Akhmetov's native Donetsk. Always a salt of the earth city, Donetsk is culturally somewhat separate from the rest of Ukraine, with a large Russian-speaking population, and in some places greater interest in being a part of the new nation of Russia than part of Ukraine. The city was highly industrialized, with major profits to be had not just via the local mines, but via all the processing plants, refineries, and transport and logistics involved with its coal, metallurgical, and agricultural industry. But it was also tough to control from the Ukrainian capital city of Kiev a few hundred kilometers away, and it alternated between being somewhat ignored at times and being made into a political contrast agent representing the old ways that Ukraine was trying to evolve from. In that broader situation, Donetsk's pre-existing networks of organized crime had a field day. The Donetsk Mafia was a powerful organization fattened for decades on a flow of manpower that had recently been released from a nearby gulag in the Soviet years, and ruling over a range of illegal nightclubs, casinos, and all of that sort of thing. When Ukraine went independent, its lack of regulations around business and taxation created a free-for-all. In the Donbass, in particular, high rates of unemployment, unusually low economic output, and the closure of mines made for a potentially lucrative environment for whoever took advantage of the situation first. The Donetsk Mafia and a wide range of rival criminal organizations spent years in a fierce and often bloody battle for control of the city's resources, as well as the resources of the outlying Donetsk Oblast. And by many accounts, Rinat Akhmetov was right there in the middle of it. Per Akhmetov himself, he got his start in the 80s and 90s, making what he referred to as risky business investments. What exactly those investments were, or how legitimate they may or may not have been, it's difficult to say. Up until 1992, when Akhmetov says that he and a pair of business partners got into the coke business. We're not talking about the soda or about the nose candy. Instead, we're talking about a byproduct of coal that can be used to produce steel. But according to other sources, that's just one part of his story around those years. By 1992, biographers and experts on Eastern Europe have alleged that Akhmetov was already deeply involved with the Donetsk criminal underworld, and the most important connection he made in those years was made all the way back in the Soviet years of the 80s. The connection that we're referring to is one Akhrat Bragin. By the time the Soviet Union fell, Bragin is widely understood to have been the leader of the Donetsk Mafia, and Akhmetov had started working with him, first as an assistant several years before Ukraine ever went independent. In those years, Bragin was allegedly involved with a range of illicit industries in Donetsk, and Akhmetov was one of, if not the chief enforcer in Bragin's criminal architecture. Allegedly, with Akhmetov's help, Bragin was able to deal with powerful unions in the Donbass and started to acquire property and other assets, including the football club Shakhtar Donetsk. Bragin became club president in 1992, during a time when Akhmetov had seemingly become quite powerful and was still by Bragin's side in business matters. According to writer Serhiy Kuzin, Akhmetov may have had his fair share of legal trouble during the 90s, but no such record exists today, allegedly because of some assistance Akhmetov may have received from his former chief of security, who later went on to be a leader in Ukrainian government. Akhmetov has always strongly denied those claims, and the truth of the matter may never be known. But whatever Akhmetov may or may not have done in those years, the events of a single day in 1995 would change his life forever. On October the 15th of that year, Akhmetov's close friend, Akhmet Bragin, would attend a match at Shakhtar Stadium, hoping to see his beleaguered footballers pull out a badly needed win against a Crimean football club that was having as difficult a time as Shakhtar was. By that time, Bragin was the richest man in eastern Ukraine, and the most powerful one at that. There were many in Donetsk and elsewhere who wished to see him dead. That was no surprise to anyone, but Bragin hadn't cared about such things for some time. Despite Shakhtar's fortunes, he was loath to miss a match, and when he was able to enjoy the festivities, he'd watch from his private box high above the pitch. On that day, though, Bragin would be killed in his box, blown up by an immensely powerful 11-pound bomb that a team of hidden assassins had squirreled away while posing as laborers in the prior few days. It was the biggest assassination in Donetsk post-Soviet history at that time, with a total of 6 people dead in the blast. Per Ukraine's Interior Ministry, delivering a statement after the fact, quoting here, all of the people killed were representatives of criminal structures in the city. By the time investigators made it to the scene, all that was left of Akhmet Bragin was a dismembered hand and forearm with his gold Rolex watch still around his wrist. But despite his habitual close proximity to Bragin, one particular Donetsk power player had escaped the blast. Rinat Akhmetov hadn't been in the box with Bragin, and according to some sources, he hadn't even come to the match. Akhmetov himself had later attested that he arrived with Bragin and wasn't far behind him when the blast went off. But wherever he had been, he was not in that box. I'll leave it to you to make of that what you will, but out of everybody in Donetsk, it was Akhmetov by far who would benefit most by Bragin's passing, and his status as Bragin's now former right-hand man would see much of Bragin's holdings end up in Akhmetov's hands. Shakhtar Donetsk would become his, Bragin's mines and factories would become his, and while Akhmetov has forcefully denied ever having inherited material wealth from Bragin, a range of sources have suggested that Akhmetov became quite a bit richer in the aftermath. Whether Akhmetov ever assumed direct control of the Donetsk mafia is harder to say, but he's faced his fair share of accusations that he may have remained involved with organized crime for some time, and perhaps never left it. In 1999, he was identified as the leader of an organized crime syndicate by a report by the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs, accusing him and his syndicate of money laundering, fraud, and exerting control over a range of both real and fictitious corporations. That report, by the way, has since been denounced by Akhmetov's largest organization, System Capital Management, and determined to be, quote, fully and publicly shown to be a fraud and a forgery by the Ministry of the Interior and a committee of Ukrainian parliamentarians in 2011. In the following years, Akhmetov would leverage his already substantial position in Donetsk to rise to the top. Now in possession of a considerable fortune that he had built up via legitimate business, Akhmetov clearly had no interest in just sitting on that wealth. In the year 2000, he founded the holding company we just mentioned, System Capital Management Group, or SCM. From there, he diversified rapidly, taking his revenues and funneling it into new acquisitions across a range of sectors. Before long, his economic power had snowballed, granting him monopolies and other forms of considerable leverage all over Ukraine, expanding far westward from the modest Donbass economy that had once defined him. And with expanding wealth came expanding influence, until before long, it wasn't just the power players in Donetsk who came to kiss the ring, it was the power players all across Ukraine. It's impossible to discuss Rinat Akhmetov during the early 2000s without mentioning one particular name, Viktor Yanukovych. Eventually, Yanukovych would rise to significant political heights, but when he first met Rinat Akhmetov, 16 years, Yanukovych's junior, they were both just little-known figures from Donetsk. Akhmetov is believed to have played a significant role in Yanukovych's rise to power in their shared home city after transitioning into politics at the end of a career in transport and logistics across the Donbass region. In 1996, Yanukovych was appointed to be vice head of Donetsk Oblast, basically a lieutenant governor position for Donetsk and the surrounding province, and it's important to emphasize the timing here. That appointment came just a year after Akhmetov's mentor had died, and Akhmetov had graduated to his place as a major power player in Donetsk. Akhmetov seemed to like what he saw in Yanukovych, and a then businessman and current parliamentarian in Ukraine, Serhiy Taruta, has since alleged that in less than a year's time after Yanukovych took office as vice head, Akhmetov had successfully lobbied Ukraine's then president to make Yanukovych governor of the oblast. Once he did, Akhmetov handpicked other allies to be his deputies. And keep Yanukovych in mind, because although for the time being, Akhmetov seemed to quite like having an ally leading the region where he kept his power base, Yanukovych would eventually surge to far greater heights, with more than a little help from his billionaire benefactor. And around that same time, another player would enter Akhmetov's orbit. This time, it wasn't a political figure, but a political party, originally known as the Party of Regional Revival of Ukraine, but adopting a simpler name in 2001 after unifying with several rival factions into the Party of Regions. Like their name suggested, the Party of Regions was meant to advocate for a shift toward regional policy, empowered local and oblast governments, and other priorities that were broadly ignored in or around Kiev, but meant a lot to far-off regions of Ukraine, like the Donbass. As one example, the Party of Regions took a controversial stance endorsing the adoption of Russian as a second state language. It's not difficult to imagine how such policies might have helped Akhmetov massively in the Donbass. After all, more money and authority to friendly state officials would create a range of highly lucrative opportunities for Akhmetov and those close to him. And although he stayed largely out of the spotlight for most of the party's history, leaked documents indicate that he's been a financier and spiritual leader within the organization for quite a while. In 2002, Akhmetov's close political ally, Yanukovych, became the Prime Minister of Ukraine, despite the Party of Regions holding just a handful of seats in parliament around that time. He was appointed by the same incumbent president who had made him leader of Donetsk Oblast, allegedly lobbied by Akhmetov, and once he took office as PM, he was able to advance interests that appeared closely in line with the sort of policies that would have benefited Akhmetov. On Ukraine's national posture, advocating for membership in the European Union, but not NATO, and drawing Ukraine closer to Russia while simultaneously sending troops to aid the United States in Iraq. But more important than anything else, Yanukovych found himself within spitting distance of the presidency. And in 2004's open presidential election, with no incumbent in sight, Yanukovych appeared to find his moment. The Party of Regions platform in 2004 was substantially more left-leaning than its prior positions and took stances that would make it a clear populist force in Ukraine's south and east, including transforming Ukraine into a federation and taking the country in a significantly more pro-Russian direction. For Yanukovych, nowhere gave him stronger support than Donetsk Oblast. We must emphasize here that these few years in Ukraine were not a particularly transparent time, and few, if any, records exist to either show that Akhmetov did play a major role in the elections or to show that he didn't. But what we do know about those elections is that they were a mess from start to finish. It was Yanukovych and the Party of Regions that would come in a very close second in a widely contested first round of voting and move to a head-to-head second round against a pro-EU, pro-NATO independent candidate. It was Yanukovych and the Party of Regions that would be declared the winner of the runoff a few weeks later. But it was Yanukovych and the Party of Regions that would face a mountain of allegations for fraud and vote rigging so bad that the European Union and the United States would refuse to recognize the results. The botched vote would kick off the Orange Revolution across Ukraine, especially in the capital city of Kiev, and for over 2 months, massive peaceful protests, general strikes, and sit-ins would paralyze the nation. Eventually, the Ukrainian Supreme Court was forced to annul Yanukovych's initial victory and contest the election again when, under far greater security and during an election deemed free and fair by the West, Yanukovych was soundly defeated. But this wouldn't be the end of the Party of Regions, nor of Yanukovych himself. Although the election ultimately fell away from Yanukovych's favor, it was still closely contested, and in a large part of Ukraine, especially the Donbass region, where Rinat Akhmetov was at his strongest, they were firmly on the side of the Party of Regions. More than that, they were embittered by the role the West had seemed to play in Ukraine's fate, and by the clear willingness of Ukraine's new leader to bring those Western influences closer. Despite the intense allegations of vote rigging and electoral interference, no high-level prosecutions would come in Ukraine for years, and with the exposure it had gained in 2004, the Party of Regions caught on in a major way. In 2006, the party surged to a major victory in parliament, and when the so-called Orange coalition opposing it eventually crumbled, the Party of Regions took full advantage. They formed a new coalition with their own allies in the socialist and communist parties, and Viktor Yanukovych became prime minister again. It's in these years that Akhmetov appeared to move out from the shadows that he had previously preferred and began to take a more active role in shaping the party's political future. He was already well on the way to becoming more of a public figure in Ukraine in his own right, starting to engage in broad philanthropic efforts and working hard to improve the image of his companies. To that end, he drew on the services of an American consultant who's since become a household name in the US and a highly controversial figure, Paul Manafort. In advance of the 2006 parliamentary elections, Akhmetov had arranged a relationship between Manafort and Yanukovych and stepped up his sponsorship efforts behind the scenes. Akhmetov even became a parliamentarian himself, elected in 2006 and again in 2007 as a Party of Regions member. American diplomatic cables would reveal that in 2007, Akhmetov spent the equivalent of $2 million US to rescue several Party of Regions members from accusations of election rigging, tax evasion, and more. With Akhmetov's help, the Party of Regions would absorb multiple other parties by the end of the 2000s, and in 2010, Viktor Yanukovych stood for election to the presidency again. This time, although he ran against a potent political rival with whom he'd done battle for several years in parliament, Yanukovych was elected in a close but decisive race. Unlike 2004, international and Ukrainian observers could find no evidence of large-scale electoral meddling, and while Yanukovych's opponent refused to concede defeat for some time, the EU and the United States were, this time, unwilling to support the challenge. Yanukovych, a man with whom Akhmetov had been entwined for well over a decade, had finally reached Ukraine's highest office. Yanukovych's years in office would see Ukraine move closer to Russia, with the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church conducting public prayers before he was sworn in, and with Yanukovych initially swearing off the idea of Ukraine joining either NATO or Russia's equivalent organization, the CSTO. Over his presidency, Yanukovych would bring Ukraine economically closer to Russia and enacted a short-lived law that allowed regions to make Russian their official second language. He'd also weather accusations of trying to destroy his political opponents with a crush of investigations and engaging in corruption on a massive scale, with Rinat Akhmetov facing allegations as one of the most deeply involved of the Ukrainian oligarch class. By late 2013, no fewer than 6 Akhmetov loyalists held cabinet positions directly under Yanukovych, and Akhmetov had acquired outright control over multiple utilities inside Ukraine, including a monopoly on telecommunications directly from the Yanukovych government. Yanukovych had also taken to installing natives of the Donbass, especially Donetsk, all up and down the Ukrainian government in a system where a very high proportion of people who'd made enough of a name in the Donbass to be chosen had gotten their start or spent much of their careers working for Akhmetov in some capacity. Nearly half of the money spent on economic and social development across Ukraine would go to Donetsk Oblast and neighboring Luhansk Oblast, where much of it would be paid out via government contracts to private industry, in a place where Akhmetov's stature as a private industrialist was simply unmatched. But when it came to the question of who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, evidence was rare and fleeting that Yanukovych could ever give his own orders to the oligarchy, and least of all, to Akhmetov. Yanukovych's political positions, or Ukraine's new pro-Russian policies, had never stood in the way of Akhmetov's ability to do business with European customers. When Yanukovych faced political pressure and opposition, the television stations Akhmetov controlled had no issue with issuing and even fostering criticism of his time in office, even as state media under Yanukovych's control showed what the president probably would have preferred by pointedly avoiding discussions on those issues. Akhmetov never faced any level of legal trouble from the government during these years, even as he engaged in the sort of trust building that would make most Western nations clutch at their pearls. Even as much as Akhmetov was a political force in Ukraine leading up to the 2014 crisis with Russia, his political influence only tells one half of the magnate story. Just as important when understanding Akhmetov is understanding the modern state of his business empire. After all, without that, he'd just be any other person in Ukraine today. The reason, in fact, that we spend so much time concentrating on Akhmetov's ties to the Party of Regions and Viktor Yanukovych is to set up the next section, and the massive explosion of Akhmetov's wealth and holdings in the same years that his close political allies were running the show. For Akhmetov, everything begins and ends with the holdings group that we mentioned before, System Capital Management Group, or SCM. SCM has been Akhmetov's flagship project since its inception, and Akhmetov has controlled it directly from day one. Even today, Akhmetov owns 100% of the shares in the organization, boasting revenues via SCM of well over $10 billion most years. Of the holding group's various companies, the biggest by far is Metinvest, an international group of steel and mining companies operating in Europe and the US. It was established in 2006 and joined the World Steel Association the following year. By itself, Metinvest boasts nearly 100,000 employees worldwide and posted revenues of $18 billion in 2021 prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That same year, it was Ukraine's largest private company and among the 10 most prolific iron ore producers in the world. Also critical to SCM's cumulative holdings is DTEK, an energy investment company with companies working in coal and natural gas, but also wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources. DTEK exports quite a bit of energy, supplies electricity to much of Ukraine, and oversees a network of supercharger stations for electric vehicles across the country. Alongside Metinvest and DTEK, Akhmetov and SCM have held a range of major assets over the years, although some have been shut down or sold off. It controlled Media Group Ukraine, which held licenses for 8 Ukrainian television channels. At the time, it was dismantled in 2022, including the major channel Ukraina. SCM owns a Russian-language tabloid that featured heavily in Akhmetov's attempts to support now former President Yanukovich, although it too was shut down in 2022. SCM controls the First Ukrainian International Bank, a major Ukrainian financial institution, and Ukrtelecom, a telecom company with a functional monopoly inside Ukraine on landline telephones. It owns ESTA Holding, which develops and sells real estate and manages several highly lucrative hotels, and Harvest, one of the country's largest agricultural companies. With all of this and more, Akhmetov and his various holdings have been ever present for many Ukrainians, interacting with Akhmetov's business interests several times over the course of an average day. Those interests have consistently been lauded for their transparency and social responsibility, with SCM, Metinvest, and DTEK ranked first, second, and third in social responsibility among all Ukrainian businesses in 2012. With such substantial holdings, Akhmetov has personally benefited in a major way. According to Forbes' annual ranking of global billionaires, Akhmetov has a net worth of over $1 billion since 2006 at the very latest, and broke into the top 150 global billionaires for the first time in 2008, with a net worth at that time of $7.3 billion. In 2011 and 2012, Akhmetov is ranked in the cumulative top 40, with wealth accumulated to $16 billion. Ukrainian magazines, especially Correspondent, have frequently produced far higher figures, suggesting that his true wealth in 2008 was well over $30 billion, and if that were the figure to have appeared on the Forbes list that year, then Akhmetov would have ranked as the 7th richest person on Earth. But just as important as Akhmetov's wide range of holdings has been the question of where they're based. As we mentioned earlier, Akhmetov has broken the mold somewhat when it comes to the highly diversified business empires of the world. Rather than leave Ukraine for more lucrative soil in Western Europe, North America, or Asia, Akhmetov has concentrated his and his company's energy squarely within the borders of Ukraine, and by all outward indicators, that's come with some major benefits. Akhmetov's close relationships with government officials and private entities, his prominence and reputation inside Ukraine, and his company's track record have all gone a long way to opening doors, busting down barriers, and passing over much of the regulatory red tape that might otherwise have held him or another person in his position back. He's gained immense wealth by any metric, but the value of that wealth is made all the greater when it's viewed relative to Ukraine. Not a poor nation per se, but certainly not a particularly well-off one. Akhmetov's devotion to business within Ukraine has meant that he's extracted a fair bit of the country's assets, but it's also ensured that Ukrainians live in an industrial ecosystem that's fully invested in their country, and where, broadly, their lot has improved year over year, with Akhmetov in a leading role. With those benefits have come some serious drawbacks, especially in recent years. Akhmetov and his businesses have worked all across Ukraine, but both their spiritual center and often their industrial center has been in the Donbas region, especially Donetsk. Beginning with the unrest that eventually led to separatist movements in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, Akhmetov has seen his assets and businesses come under relentless assault, and that assault got far worse once Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Over the past decade, Akhmetov has had major holdings seized and seen his business offices attacked at a large scale, while in Luhansk Oblast, the Russian-controlled Luhansk People's Republic has taken direct control of several of his companies. Even before Russian tanks ever rolled westward en masse, Akhmetov has been in the economic crosshairs of Russia and its Donbas puppets, and has been pushed out of his home city for the long term. In 2015, his personal wealth sharply deteriorated, and while it bounced back most of the way by 2018, it tanked yet again in the years leading to Russia's invasion. We're gone, of course, that even on Akhmetov's worst days, he's got several $1 billion to his name and has remained firmly in first place when it comes to the wealth of Ukrainian oligarchs. But even still, the majority of Akhmetov's former wealth is still no longer his own, owing to a cascade of difficulties that began several years prior to 2022. The trouble for Akhmetov really kicked off in 2013, at the same time that trouble came cascading down onto the head of Viktor Yanukovych in the form of the Euromaidan protests. Although they wouldn't begin in force until November of that year, the discontent that led to Euromaidan had been brewing for months, as Ukrainians began to chafe more and more under the status quo that Yanukovych, Akhmetov, and the rest of the Ukrainian oligarchy had built. By that time, corruption in Ukraine went far beyond just the influence of Akhmetov. It was institutionalized at all levels of society, from the country's highest executive to doctors and teachers in the communities. It wasn't just that money talked. Instead, money screamed so loud that it drowned out nearly everything else. In those same months, Ukraine had been moving toward the finalization of a massive political and economic pact, the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. If signed, the agreement would have ushered in an era of broad cooperation with the EU, plus a whole raft of social changes and regulatory improvements that would have drastically improved the lot of ordinary Ukrainians and undone much of the government's corruption culture. But in the late summer of 2013, Russia began to exert considerable economic pressure on its westward neighbor, and at the 11th hour, pro-Russian President Yanukovych did what much of the country halfway feared that he would do, and halfway knew was coming. It was 1 week to go before the agreement was to be finalized. Yanukovych pulled Ukraine from the deal, citing, in a call with officials in Lithuania, quote, economic pressure and blackmail from Russia. According to Lithuania's president, Russia had attempted to both undercut the trade terms the EU is offering Ukraine and eviscerate the section of the Ukrainian economy that still depended on Russia if the deal went through. Immediately, mass protests erupted in Kiev's Independence Square, which was quickly transformed into a barricaded encampment for a movement that was thousands strong. The protesters were well organized, setting up broadcast stations, communal kitchens, and more, but the crackdowns, when they arrived, were fierce by the Yanukovych government. According to some allegations, Yanukovych used the Berkut, a special police force under his direct command, to attack and torture the protesters. Indisputably, he passed anti-protest laws that were internationally condemned as draconian. Yet the protests didn't stop. They just grew larger, and by January of 2014, people started dying. Toward the end of the month, many of Ukraine's provincial government buildings were taken over by local protesters, and in the final days of the movement, nearly 100 protesters were killed in Kiev during an advance toward the national parliament, along with over a dozen police officers. Barely a day after the worst of the violence, Yanukovych's political position had collapsed so thoroughly that he agreed to usher in a unity government and an early election cycle to replace him, while the national parliament voted 386-0 to reinstate an earlier version of Ukraine's constitution. Under the cover of darkness, Yanukovych fled Kiev and then all of Ukraine. Despite insisting via televised statements that he was Ukraine's rightful leader, he was removed with the full-throated support of all the political parties in parliament that had once worked alongside him, including the Party of Regions. While over 100 parliamentarians did not attend the vote to oust Yanukovych, not a single one voted in his favor. A few days later, he turned up in Russia, to the surprise of basically nobody. He's remained there ever since. For Rinat Akhmetov, Euromaidan was a time of chickens coming home to roost. Owing to his known ties to Yanukovych, he was an early target of the protest movement, and he was an especially potent symbol of the oligarchy's overreaches. By that time, Akhmetov basically ran Ukraine's power industry. He was confronted directly at least once in Denet by a group of protesters, and when the Yanukovych government toppled at last, it was Akhmetov who was widely seen as being among the earliest and most potent targets of the new government's justice system. Going after him would have been a widely popular next move, and after Yanukovych fled into exile, Akhmetov did face investigation that aimed to punish the oligarchs and kleptocrats. But he was able to slow this coming onslaught, at least somewhat, by way of his decision to lay low and let Yanukovych sink, rather than coming to his defense during the height of the protests. Not only that, but he was saved by some very convenient timing in a moment when everything in Ukraine, not just in Akhmetov's orbit, risked crumbling into nothing. On February the 22nd, 2014, Yanukovych had fled to Donetsk and then to the Isthmus of Crimea. 2 days later, on February the 24th, Yanukovych made it to Russia. And 2 days after that, on the night of February the 26th, Russian forces, disguised as a purported Crimean militia, seized Crimea's Supreme Council, its Council of Ministers, its airports, its media and broadcast stations, and more. By morning, Crimea was under the control of unmarked Russian forces, and Ukraine had entered a very different sort of unrest. With funerals still ongoing in Kiev for those killed at the height of the Euromaidan protests, Crimean parliamentarians voted while under occupation to end the Crimean government and appoint a Crimean prime minister who was known to be be so Russia-friendly that he'd present the territory to Vladimir Putin on a silver platter. Within days, Russians disguised as Berkut operatives, apparently alongside actual Berkut operatives, took to positions at points of entry and exit all across Crimea. By the 2nd of March, Crimea was under complete Russian control. 14 days later, the Russian-organized referendum would purportedly see nearly 97% of Crimeans vote to reunify with Russia. 2 days later, Crimea was annexed formally by Moscow amid the protests of the United Nations and the vast majority of the Western world. For Akhmetov, the situation in Crimea posed only a minor threat in terms of his business. There, he had only 2 factories, one that made railway switches and one that made enamel dishware. Neither were a particularly difficult loss, and nor was a holiday estate that Akhmetov had owned there. But far more important to Akhmetov were the protests in Donetsk, which had broken out for the first time on the 1st of March. Around this time, Ukrainian pollsters were still able to operate freely in the area, and so we know with some confidence what most people in the Donbass region wanted. Just a bit under 1/3 looking to separate from Ukraine entirely, and close to 2/3 more interested in autonomous status while still remaining a part of Ukraine. The reasons for that were wide-ranging, largely having to do with backlash to the Euromaidan movement and the following upheaval in government, but they came to a head for the first time when the government's headquarters in Rinat, Akhmetov's own city, Donetsk, were occupied for several days by a group of protesters. To give an idea of who exactly those protesters were, they'd eventually appoint a neo-Nazi named Pavel Gubarev to be the so-called People's Governor in the Oblast. About a month later, simultaneously inspired and frustrated by the ease with which Crimea had been brought under control, thousands of people rallied in Donetsk to demand that their oblast either got far greater autonomy or be allowed to join Russia outright. By this time, it's difficult to say what proportion of the movement was a product of authentic grassroots organization in the Donbass and what proportion was orchestrated by Russia, realizing it could pull off a repeat performance, but in practice, it really wouldn't matter very much. Armed, masked men stormed into the Donetsk government headquarters, and on the following day they declared independence from Ukraine as the Donetsk People's Republic. The neighboring oblast of Luhansk would take a similar approach, and before long, Russian allied militants had taken control of much of Donetsk, including the critical cities of Maripol, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk. Lacking a substantial military to fight back, Ukraine authorized a wide range of territorial and ideological volunteer battalions to do the dirty work instead, and before long, much of the Donbass was wrapped up in a low-grade war. How Akhmetov chose to react was a decision that had the potential to decide the course of the conflict. And in another life, Akhmetov may well have chosen to join the separatists. The Donbass, and particularly Donetsk, was his home. It was his base of industrial power, and it was a part of Ukraine where his personal power and influence were at an all-time high. With a workforce hundreds of thousands strong, Akhmetov had not just the financial capital, but the manpower to raise a real army, one that could have locked down the situation in the same way Russia had locked down Crimea. If he'd taken up with the separatists, Akhmetov might have been welcomed with open arms and made a king, perhaps in service to Russia, but perhaps becoming the corporate overlord of a massive and economically powerful swath of territory where he could have gained total control. But Akhmetov didn't do that. Perhaps it was his business interests in Europe and the United States that drew him in the opposite direction, fearing that they might tolerate an oligarch but wouldn't do business with a warlord. Perhaps it was the ideological elements clearly splayed out across Donetsk's separatist movement, making it abundantly clear that a Sunni Muslim like Akhmetov might even have found himself in danger. Or perhaps it was a sense of loyalty, either to Ukraine itself or to the oligarch class that had so recently consolidated its control over the nation. Last of all, perhaps he was put off from the idea by the people's governor himself in Donetsk, who had proclaimed that Akhmetov personally bribed some 2/3 of the separatists, accusations that Akhmetov worked hard to shut down and deny. More likely, it was a mix of all four, and some extra factors thrown in too. But whatever the truth of Akhmetov's motivations, the result was the same. Within a month or two of the formation of the post-Euromaidan government, Akhmetov had made it abundantly clear that he would be working alongside them, even despite the political interest in investigating him. From afar, Akhmetov watched separatists take control of his Yanukovich iron steelworks factory in Donetsk and nationalize it, and force the football club Shakhtar Donetsk out of the region. Then they moved on to the city of Maripol, a critical industrial center for Ukraine and the true center of Akhmetov's economic power in the Donbass. There, Akhmetov owns not just the Ilekhan and steelworks, but the Azovstal steel plant, which has since spent its own fair share of time in the global spotlight. After Ukraine lost the city, Akhmetov took direct action, organizing thousands of his steelworkers within Maripol and deploying them in the streets. Without much bloodshed, and largely unarmed, the workers were able to retake control of the city while the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic disappeared into the city. The Donetsk insurgency would accuse him of betraying his people, but such accusations seemed to hurt the separatists far more than they helped. If Akhmetov had been waiting before that moment to see how things would play out, then the wait was over. As his workers retook Maripol, Akhmetov issued a harsh condemnation of the separatist movement, quoting here, "You will not intimidate us. Nobody will intimidate us, including those who call themselves the so-called Donetsk People's Republic." He accused the Donetsk People's Republic of genocide and orchestrated a daily act of peaceful protest in Donetsk, with pro-peace drivers creating a chorus of car horns at noon each day. Organizations of steelworkers like the ones in Maripol began to fan out in major cities, including the capital Donetsk, and when they didn't prove as effective in restoring order as the workers in Maripol had been, he changed his approach. According to both Ukrainian and foreign fighters of the country's new volunteer battalions, when interviewed by Western journalists, Akhmetov was alleged to be paying good money for them to take up arms and fight back. That money allegedly extended to the controversial Azov Battalion, an organization that was already espousing racist and neo-Nazi ideology, but was a popular hub for foreign fighters who were becoming instrumental in the defense of the Donbass. Alongside Akhmetov, other members of the oligarchy had been diverting significant wealth of their own to the new battalions until they had become a formidable fighting force that could stand up to the separatist movement. Simultaneously, Akhmetov was forced to walk a tightrope between taking sides in the Donbass hostilities and ensuring that his industrial base didn't collapse under the crossfire. To the dismay of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, which was now starkly and militantly opposed to the survival of any separatist intent in the Donbass, Akhmetov moderated his position by diverting additional funds to supply aid to the areas hit hardest, including when those areas were under separatist control. By August, he had established the Rinat Akhmetov Humanitarian Center, attempting to provide assistance to the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, regardless of which side of the fight they were on. That assistance included not just humanitarian and medical aid, but direct financial assistance and psychological care. According to the Foundation's own website, the money came from everywhere, from SCM Group, all of its subsidiaries, from FC Shakhtar Donetsk, and from everywhere else Akhmetov could find it. Over the next 2 years, a separate food delivery foundation Akhmetov had put together would donate some 10 million food packages to families in need across Donetsk and Luhansk, providing a range of non-perishables in comprehensive bundles. Politically, Akhmetov began pushing hard for a peace settlement that would see Ukraine keep its territorial integrity, emphasizing at the same time that government decentralization and more autonomy for the Donbass would likely come with it. For a while, the situation in the Donbass would stagnate after a substantial counter-offensive by Ukrainian forces had nearly ended the separatist crisis, only for Russia to flood troops, tanks, and heavy equipment into the Donbass in order to surge back and keep the war going. After that push and pull, and after a brief ceasefire fell apart in early 2015, the front lines were largely frozen. But after a couple of years spent kicking at a Ukrainian defense that seemingly wouldn't move, the separatists turned their attention toward other methods of consolidating control over the territory they held, and Akhmetov's work became a prime target. In 2017, his offices and businesses fell under concerted attacks by pro-separatist protesters, and both Metinvest and DTEK, Akhmetov's most substantial business assets, were subjected to seizures and holdings all across the Donbass. Donbass and Luhansk took direct control of any organization that they could reach, and the FC Shakhtar Arena, now converted into a warehouse for Akhmetov's relief organizations, was blocked off. Around that same time, Akhmetov saw some of the peril he'd narrowly escaped with Euromaidan start bubbling back up for him in Ukraine. On the one hand, Akhmetov had made himself indispensable for Kiev. After all, his companies paid incredible amounts of tax dollars into the government. Those same companies both employed a great deal of people and extracted a great deal of wealth from eastern regions where Kiev could no longer reach. But Akhmetov's close ties with the government fell under harsh scrutiny anyhow. Akhmetov was accused of corruption and war profiteering, with critics emphasizing a recent government buyout of many of Akhmetov's debts and blaming his political leverage over the Ukrainian president for the president's slowness in passing critical reforms. Ultimately, nothing would come of the investigations against his businesses, and Akhmetov would remain Ukraine's richest man, with Bloomberg assessing that he was able to recoup his considerable losses stemming from the Donbass war by roughly 2018. But his industrial power in the nation was severely curtailed, and while he and the Ukrainian government were interested in continuing to work together, both were forced to recognize a more difficult reality. The oligarchy couldn't survive without the government, any more so than the government could survive without the oligarchy. The coming years would see continued frustration inside Ukraine, with the Donbass separatist movement alongside significant political change on the home front. In 2019, a career comedian and entertainer named Volodymyr Zelensky trounced the current president, a close Akhmetov ally, and assumed Ukraine's highest office. Running on a strong anti-establishment, anti-corruption platform and advocating unity between Ukraine and the Donbass, Zelensky was inclined to take strong action against the oligarchy. By that time, Akhmetov had seen his political forces in parliament winnowed away as well, leaving him open to an attack that came in 2021 when Zelensky signed into law a bill that specifically targeted the oligarchy. The bill would have established a special register of oligarchs, including people who held fortunes at or above 1 million times the Ukrainian living wage, owned monopoly companies, held excessive influence over the media, and participated heavily in political life in the country. Akhmetov allegedly ticked all those boxes, and he did not take kindly to the law's introduction. Akhmetov and his television channels launched an all-out assault on Zelensky, relentlessly working to discredit both the president and his government. It worked, with Zelensky's popularity sent plummeting, but Akhmetov appeared to have overplayed his hand. In November of 2021, Zelensky alleged that Akhmetov had been part of a Russian-backed coup conspiracy attempting to overthrow him, revealing that Ukraine had intelligence and audio intercepts implicating Akhmetov's direct involvement. Akhmetov was the only conspirator Zelensky named, with unnamed sources suggesting that Zelensky had been provided US intelligence that an attempt at internal destabilization involving a Ukrainian oligarch might be coming. Akhmetov forcefully denied the allegations, quoting here, "I am outraged by the spread of this lie. No matter what the president's motives are, I will continue to defend a free Ukraine, a free economy, democracy, and freedom of speech." And to Akhmetov's credit, we do need to emphasize that he was never charged in regard to the alleged coup conspiracy, and has lived in Ukraine, sharing a country with President Zelensky to this day. But he was still dealt a major defeat, and while he clearly had no intent of giving up his wealth, he was compelled to do something to escape being wrapped up into the oligarchs' registry. After a considerable back and forth didn't work out in his favor, Akhmetov surrendered the licenses of all his television channels, leaving the media business entirely and putting an end to his print and internet media as well. Describing the move as, quote, an involuntary decision, Akhmetov shuttered his holdings, and in return, Ukraine's Minister of Justice confirmed that Akhmetov no longer fit the Ukrainian legal definition of an oligarch. He was very, very rich, he held monopolies, but he wasn't in politics and he wasn't in media. So by Ukraine's own definition, he was in the clear. These years hadn't been kind to Rinat Akhmetov, beyond just the coup allegations he faced. Personally, Akhmetov suffered other tragedies. In 2021, his older brother Igor passed away due to health complications relating to his life's work in Donetsk coal mines. He was forced to watch as many of his old holdings in the Donbass were dismantled, made defunct, or put to work for the separatist cause. He weathered a limited degree of scrutiny from the United States, as his old connections to Paul Manafort were dredged up with investigations relating to Donald Trump. All the while, Akhmetov continued to work toward Ukraine's survival, purchasing hundreds of ambulances in 2019 and funding much of Ukraine's COVID responses, including the purchase of hundreds of ventilators. But in the grand view, it was difficult to refute the idea that Akhmetov's position was weakening further and further in advance of the carnage that had already been kicked off by the time Akhmetov's media assets were surrendered. For any person who's enjoyed our War Graphics channel for any length of time, or in fact any person who's not been living completely under a rock for the whole of the early 2020s, the events of February and March 2022 should not be a surprise. Russian troops, tanks, and warplanes screamed across the Ukrainian border in a full-scale invasion, and one that looked as if it would send Kiev toppling within a few days' time. In the early moments of the invasion, as the community in his industrial base of Maripol took to the streets to protest Russia, Akhmetov announced that SCM Group would pay the equivalent of $34 million US in advance taxes. His charitable organizations got to work setting up aid supply lines and humanitarian drives in advance of what would likely be an apocalyptically bad end for the Ukrainian nation. That didn't happen. And as the Russian advance choked and sputtered into a much more protracted conflict, Akhmetov and the rest of the Ukrainian billionaire class faced a future that could see them maintain their stature in their home nation. But in Akhmetov's case, he was forced to reckon with the uncomfortable reality that the region that formed his critical industrial base was now going to be a battlefield, and potentially for a very long time. Nowhere was that more of an urgent reality than in Maripol, where the steelworks plant that we mentioned previously, Azovstal, was now part of the site of a bitter siege. As the rest of Maripol was captured, thousands of Ukrainian defenders, including the Azov battalion that Akhmetov had allegedly sponsored, took fortified positions in the steelworks plant. Leveraging its hardy workshop, its vast inner complex, and an underbelly of tunnels that could be transformed into a layered defensive position, the people there would hold out under intense aerial bombardment and ground attacks all the way through mid-May. In the aftermath, the Azovstal plant was largely demolished, and Akhmetov's industrial legacy in Maripol along with it. But over the course of the war, Akhmetov would turn his attention far beyond Maripol, quickly claiming a spot as Ukraine's foremost single private donor and retaining that position for the duration of the war thus far. By late 2022, Akhmetov had provided some $100 million worth of aid, splitting it between humanitarian aid like food and medical supplies and warfighting equipment. A few months later, the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation was estimated to have helped some 18 million Ukrainians over the war's first year, contributing everything from drones to body armor to fortifications for the Ukrainian military and propping up the country's critical infrastructure amidst intense bombardment. Akhmetov's Heart of Azovstal project set up a fund to help the families of those who had fought and died in Maripol, starting with an infusion of $25 million worth of support from Akhmetov personally. Hundreds of thousands of food packages and hygiene kits were supplied via the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation and another Akhmetov-related charity, the Saving Lives Initiative, via the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation and another Akhmetov-related charity, the Saving Lives Initiative, while an organization called Rinat Akhmetov Steel Front had organized direct support to the Ukrainian armed forces. Akhmetov's businesses, particularly SCM Group and its subsidiaries, have provided their employees en masse help in protection and support efforts, backing up Ukraine's logistical supply chains and protecting and rebuilding medical, power, water, and other essential infrastructure. By the war's 2-year anniversary, Akhmetov Steel Front had donated 200,000 pieces of mostly specially designed body armor, 5,000 drones, 1,200 cars and vehicles, and far more, even working to create and distribute so-called hedgehogs, anti-tank obstacles made of steel I-beams and scattered around areas where Russia is expected to roll through. The DTEK conglomerate now supplies free electricity at large scale and has worked overtime to deal with Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, while FC Shakhtar is playing a leading role in receiving and resettling internal migrants. At the time of writing, Akhmetov is believed to have poured some $250 million into the Ukrainian war effort at a bare minimum, with the true figure likely to be a good bit higher than that. All the while, Akhmetov watched as his own finances were gutted by the Russian invasion. According to Forbes, Akhmetov's fortune was as large as $14 billion or so prior to the invasion, and 2 weeks later, it had shrunk to $6 billion. In 2024, that number shrank even further to around $4 billion. Despite his own loss of financial position, Akhmetov has continued to raise wages at his many companies and has invested significantly in efforts to explore new and innovative technologies to beat back the Russian advance. Starting in 2022, Akhmetov has launched lawsuits against the Russian Federation for damages of between 17 and $20 billion and has extended those attempts to seek compensation to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. But in practice, these are less of a serious effort to gain a court settlement against Russia and more of an initiative to get the international legal system moving in efforts to punish and seek reparations for Russia's destruction of Ukraine and its economy. Akhmetov has vowed that any damages that are eventually paid to him or his companies will be diverted to reconstruction efforts across Ukraine. In more recent months, Akhmetov's power infrastructure assets through DTEK have come under the heaviest attacks from Russia as a largely ineffective offensive has forced Russia to seek other mechanisms to cause a collapse within Ukraine. From March 2024 onward, DTEK's power plants have come under many attacks, seeing a reduction in power generation capacity anywhere between 50 and 95% at varying times. But through DTEK, Akhmetov has remained defiant. One example being the energy conglomerate has made history by becoming the first group to build a wind farm during a war located about 100 kilometers from where Ukraine's front lines were at the time that DTEK broke ground. The conglomerate has even gained the support of the Ukrainian champion boxer Alexander Usyk in a broad public relations and awareness campaign. Elsewhere, Akhmetov's relief drives are still very much ongoing, and with Russia's advance achieving only marginal gains across the front lines, it doesn't appear that Ukraine's adversary has the means to truly disrupt Akhmetov's initiatives on a large scale. In 2024, Akhmetov put a comfortable distance between himself and Ukraine's next most critical private donor, leveraging a combination of humanitarian, economic, and industrial might unlike anything else the Ukrainian oligarchy has achieved. He's still Ukraine's richest man, although the margins are slimmer now, and while the level of personal affection he shares with Volodymyr Zelensky is unclear, he's still never faced a single criminal charge, while his businesses are largely immune from investigation amidst the war effort. Although FC Shakhtar hasn't played in Donetsk for a very long time, the club has been playing out of Kiev since 2020 and has leased a stadium in Warsaw since 2022, while becoming a powerful symbol of Ukrainian resistance via an Emmy Award-winning 4-part Paramount Plus documentary, Football Must Go On. For the near term, it appears Rinat Akhmetov's future is the same as the rest of Ukraine. As the country's most important individual backer, and as a person whose interests are inextricably tied to Ukraine itself, he's got just as much of a personal stake in Ukraine's wartime survival as anyone else in the country. When speaking about what he believes a victorious Ukraine must look like in peacetime, Akhmetov is careful to emphasize that anything short of the full return of the Donbass and Crimea simply would not be a just conclusion. He's been aggressive in his condemnation of Putin and in his characterization of Russia's acts as war crimes, and he's vowed to invest in a, quote, new Marshall Plan in order to create a Europeanized Ukraine that is both governed democratically and free of the large-scale corruption that Akhmetov himself is alleged to have benefited from. And in a hypothetical Ukraine that has emerged from the shadow of war, badly bruised but surviving, it's worth asking whether Rinat Akhmetov might ever become more than a shadowy private sponsor. President Zelensky has been able to extend his mandate in office past the expiration of his first term, buoyed by a Ukrainian public that's broadly quite comfortable with the idea of delaying new elections until after the war ends, despite intense Russian propaganda efforts in the West to frame Zelensky's extended presidency as a fundamentally undemocratic act. Become peacetime, Zelensky will eventually face elections, and after what has undoubtedly been a brutal few years for Zelensky personally, he may not even run. A number of potential successors could end up vying for the presidency in such a situation, among them the highly popular boxer-turned-mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, and the influential governor of Mykolaiv Oblast, Vitaly Kim. But even in a race against popular rivals, a person of Akhmetov's exceptional wealth, power, and long-cultivated humanitarian reputation could have the potential to surge to success. So would he ever do it? If past behavior predicts future decisions, then it's not terribly likely. Although Akhmetov has held a seat in parliament in the past, he was largely politically disengaged from the affair, and some have alleged that he was more interested in what a parliamentary seat used to offer, specifically a guarantee of prosecutorial immunity, than the process of policymaking and legislation. Nor has Akhmetov's political modus operandi seen him express any interest in the public prominence and scrutiny that the presidency would bring. Instead, he's long preferred to work through political parties and leaders through which he might have exercised influence or even control from behind the scenes. Not only that, but he may face more basic barriers to candidacy. Even though it's a relatively pluralistic society, Islamophobia is still a force within Ukraine, and it would be likely difficult for a practicing Sunni Muslim to overcome prejudice within the population, especially if opposed by a candidate who would play on such prejudice in order to try and even the playing field against Akhmetov's wealth. And finally, such direct political participation would likely see him fit back within Ukraine's formalized definition of an oligarch and see him put on a registry as such. Whether he could remove such a scarlet letter once he gained office is another question entirely, but the damage to his image in the meantime, during a tough and tightly contested campaign, is too important of a factor to miss. Yet, even if he doesn't try to assume the mantle of the presidency, it is likely that Akhmetov will play a critical role in Ukraine's eventual reconstruction, if and when that time finally comes. Compared to any and every person in Ukraine, Akhmetov's humanitarian conduct during the war has proved that he's capable of doing the real work of supporting the country and its people, and his ability and willingness to leverage his companies to do it has proved that he has access to the sort of economic infrastructure that would be critical in a comprehensive effort to rebuild. In past decades, a new president, hoping to gain support among the people, might have turned their back on Akhmetov in order to show that they could manage such a huge political undertaking without the involvement of the oligarch class. But now, with Akhmetov's image inside Ukraine shifted dramatically, it's difficult to argue that a future president would have more to gain from pushing Akhmetov out than by leveraging his considerable fortunes and the logistical and monetary structures he's gone to the trouble of creating. Rinat Akhmetov is in the same situation today as every other person inside Ukraine. He lives in a nation at war, where despite a geographically isolated and consistent front line, danger is still ever present across the country. The idea that Akhmetov would survive the war at all is no more dependable than it was for the over 10,000 Ukrainian civilians estimated to have been killed in the war thus far. But assuming Akhmetov does live to see a peace, then Ukraine's richest and most complicated supporter is going to be indispensable for what comes next. What that means for Ukraine is difficult to say in the long run, as the pull of capitalist enrichment conflicts with the push for humanitarian reconstruction. But how Rinat Akhmetov finds his way through such a dynamic will likely predict the way Ukraine builds back in the aftermath, be it for better or for worse.